My daddy's family, Montjoy, the old homesteads up in West Donegal Street. And back in those days when people had a pretty good sized family, they hired their children out, to different farmers and so on. Most of my daddy and mother's family, I believe, were hired out at one time or other. But what I remember, my grandpa and the family on my mother's side, they lived across from what now is Larry Murphy Chevrolet in a house there. I remember going to the funeral for my grandpa. I haven't eaten any ham that tasted as good as that since. But that's where she came from. But she was a hired girl down here on Henry Heaston's farm. That's down where Armstrong is now, Melly Newcomer's farm. Mm-hmm. And my daddy was a hired boy there. She was a hired girl there. And that's where they met. And that's later on they get married when they were maybe 20 years old, something like that. Mm-hmm. And of course the first 3 children they had were boys. Now this is panic years, not depression, but panic. There was no money. And my daddy couldn't afford to take these boys to a barber shop to get their hair cut, so he started to cut it. And it got so that every Sunday afternoon or whatever, when he would cut their hair, the neighbors would all come in, and it got to the point where he got to learn to cut hair pretty good. So when they moved up into town here, then the first barber shop that he opened, I think, was up where Lester Huber's place is. It's a double house where Mary Enterline lives. There, the S-turn up here at Stony Battery Road. Half of the house is in West Temfield and the other half's in East Temfield. And my family first went to school back here at Maple Grove. But then when we moved down here next to the Methodist Church, well, then they went to Landisville, Frog Hollow and then Landisville. But when my daddy opened the first shop outside of the house, was down here in a little building around where Johnny Cooper's place is, across from Easton's store. By the way, the band used to rehearse upstairs, above the barber shop. And that's where this blotter comes into being. Because that blotter says Salunga Barber Shop, close to the post office. And the post office was over in Heaston's store, in the one corner of the store. Shaves 10 cents, haircuts 10 cents. That was a price. And that price stood until maybe during the First World War. And I remember when then it must have been 15 and 10. If that picture that you'll get a picture of probably, it was 15 cents for a haircut, 10 cents for a shave. But then when I took it over in 1926, they were, after First World War in 1919, my daddy and Johnny Kern raised the price from 15 to 25 cents. And when they raised the price that much, some of my daddy's best friends didn't want to get a haircut. It cost too much. But that's what it was when I started in 1926.
Did you start with your dad in business?
I worked for my brother in town in the middle 20s. 24, 25. My daddy died in January 26. And then that's when I came out here and started on my own business.
Now, did you start next door here on Main Street, or were you over by Cooper's?
I started over here alongside the Methodist Church. That's where he was later on then. In 1917, when that picture was taken, he was in the house next to the Methodist Church, and that's where it was in 1926. Then I bought this Raffensperger's harness shop here in 34. Of course, I'm here ever since. And that's one thing I got rid of when I first opened the shop. A cuspidor and shaving mugs, which I wish I had today. They're worth a lot of money. Mm-hmm. old shaving mugs.
Everybody had his own mug then.
Yeah, almost everybody, but a lot of hard got shaved every day. And my last customer was Norm Bender. He could shave 3 times a week. Then Charlie Meese, you remember Charlie Meese?
Yeah.
Well, his daughter, his son was married to Charlie Meese's daughter. And Charlie got Norm an electric razor. And that was the last of the shaving. Shaving was all finished. Oh, I shave every now and then, but not very often. Not too many get shaved anymore.
Is there a story about that propeller up there?
Yeah, Chris Dillinger worked over at Sensenix, where they built those propellers. Chris lived down here at Florida town. He was a bricklayer, and at that time he worked at the Sensenix Brothers. And whenever a prop was overbalanced, they'd throw them out in the junkyard, and then these guys would pick them up and polish them up and sell them for a couple bucks.
Sure.
So that's how I got that.
Yeah. I have something like that in my basement. Mine's a Piper Cub. I don't know what
Is there a clock in it?
No.
They used to put clocks in them. And in the 60s, around 64, I think my daughter, well, I had a beauty shop down there, and my daughter run a beauty shop down there at next to the church for a while. She gave that up and got a job. Her husband talked her into getting out of the business. If she'd be in the beauty shop and hairstyling business today, she'd have it made, you know.
Right.
But that's one of those things.
Was your shop originally have electricity in, or was it not?
I don't remember of the carbide lamps, but I know I can see the tank setting back at the back end of the shop, and I used the pump I used later on when I was a kid to pump up my bicycle tires. They put carbide in a container, in a tank, and then they would pump air into it. It would go out through these little metal. Some of those I remember. Some of the lights in the metal tubing, but I don't remember the lights really. But in 1917, when that picture was taken, the lights are out in the open. I mean, the wires are out in the open, little knobs, you know. So they had electricity, and that was November 1917.
Do you remember electricity coming to Salonga, or was that early on?
I don't really remember of it coming through, but when I could remember, and I was only 10 years old then, you know, but as far back as I can remember, there was electricity. And the telephone was something out of the ordinary. And I do remember one of my old schoolmates that worked at the telephone exchange back in those days. Her name was Anna Dadisman, one of the Dadisman girls. But I don't know why I can't think of the lady's name. He was a school director. He's the guy who used to, when they'd build something, you know, he'd go around and pick up nails and stuff that were discarded. He'd to save a couple bucks, you know.
Sure.
I don't know if his name was long or not. Somebody should know about that. But that's funny. I just can't remember that right now.
Okay.
But that's the house right up there in the northeast intersection of the street there where the garage is. And that was Ben Long. Ben Long's daddy and Walter Hershey were mechanics in that garage back in those days.
You told me that they generated electricity not far from here, out in E.B. Chicky's Road?
Yeah, out at Bender's Mill. They I don't know what year that would have been. That would be 30, 40 years ago probably, when they set up a hydroelectric plant. And what a lot of people don't know, we don't know how many hydroelectric plants there were in Lancaster County back in those days, back years ago. 10 or 12 of them. There was almost a dozen, I believe, that they had generated electricity. But this was, I don't know if they had some kind of run-in with with the electric company or not, but the farmers all went together and they decided to put up a hydroelectric plant and generate electricity. And they did that for a number of years out there. I'm not too sure. That's when I think Raymond Davis lived on that Bender's. That would be Grace Davis's father-in-law, Jory Davis's daddy, lived in that old mill house. And see, that was an old mill, Bender's Mill.
Huh.
And that's where Johnny Bender's daddy, that's where Johnny Bender was raised.
I see.
In that old mill house. That was Joe Bender's mill, and maybe his daddy. I'm not too sure about that.
While we're talking about the Benders, can you tell me about Bender's store? When did that start? That wasn't originally Bender's.
No, originally it was Sam Eby. Sam Eby had a store for back before I can remember, probably, and his daughter Martha Eby, who later married Norman Bear, she taught school mostly back here at Maple Grove School. Martha Eby, she taught a lot of the youngsters back in those days. I'm trying to think. I'm thinking of too many things at the same time. But I don't know what year it would have been that Howard Pfeiffer bought that store from Sam Eby when Sam retired. Or maybe passed away. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. But Howard didn't run the store too long until Johnny Bender bought it from him. 1925, John Bender bought the store, and his daddy helped him in the store all those years. He was there, and they sold everything: shoes, underwear, shirts, stockings, and haberdashery, you know, besides groceries. That was the days of the old barrels. Everything was out in the open, you know, all that. Real sanitary.
You said there was a restaurant in the store too?
Yeah, on this side, on the east side of the restaurant was a little, they'd put a snack bar there. Yeah, and I don't know when they, I'm not too sure when they bought the house next door. That was, well, actually, that was Groff's place.
Harvey.
No, Harvey's daddy, and it actually belonged to Goldie Groff. Goldie Zerfe Groff. That would be Hostler and Hostler and Elsie Zerfe Hostler, sister. That was her place. Her and her husband Harvey Groff.
So Bender's bought that and then made that into a restaurant?
Yeah, and I don't know what year that would have been. I have no idea what it don't seem, to me it don't seem like too long ago, but probably 30 years ago, you know, like so.
Now, you also mentioned that the railroad tracks weren't always straight through Salunga. They used to come up through the town and around.
Yeah, the railroad track came across at, what is it, Stamen's garage, and went back through. That was a vacant lot down here where Stamen's garage is and where McFarland's is. That was a vacant lot, and the train came through there and met the trolley track back here along Stony Battery Road, and that was called Prospect. Well, now it's Prospect. We called it the road. That was where the trolley stopped there too. And they met out around there and went up to where the creek is, and met where now the railroad track was up there. But they took this curve out, same as they took the curve out of this highway. Here was a 3-lane. Took all those curves out. And that, I think, was 1907 when the railroad went through here. I think it would tell you in here someplace.
There was a station here?
Yeah, there was a station in Landisville, in Salunga, and there was 2 stations in Landisville. And there was a tar in Landisville. The first station agent that I remember on the Pensy down at Landisville was Omer Bushong. Art Bushong played with us in the sports teams, basketball, football, baseball. And Omer Bushong was a great sport enthusiast, and he was managed the baseball team back in the teens and the 20s. And they had a real good ball club. But he was a station agent for the Pensy, and the only name I can come up with in the Reading station was McKinney. And a guy by the name of Nod Harmon from Montjoy operated the tar, and that was a building on the southwest intersection of the Reading and Pensy. He pulled the levers to turn the switches and so on, and give them a red light or whatever, you know. And those station agents in those days, they had to be able to read code. They sent all of their messages by wire with a key, you know. The same as you had to do with this radio here, you know, the shortwave radio. Only it was wire then. It was no. See, there wasn't any wireless until it wasn't much until around the First World War.
You had to use telegraph wires to...
Telegraphy.
I see.
That's what it was. That's what they used. And right across from the station there at Landisville, the Pensy station, right across the tracks, was a hotel called the Benjamin Hotel. There's not too many people know about that, I'm sure. I don't think there's anybody. Norm Bars might, and Cy Minnick, they might. I'm not too sure. But the rest of them, it's a shame that Amos wouldn't be here to talk about this, because he made more of a study of that than anybody, I think.
Was that a big hotel?
I would say it was a three stories high. And it was long. It was like the Landisville Hotel. It was longer and maybe not as wide. It more like a motel would be today, you know.
Was this for travelers or workers or what?
I think it was probably people that were on their way to see it. At that time, things didn't go as fast as they do today. They kind of rested up every now and then. But I don't remember necessarily of a hotel being close to the railroad tracks at Montjoy or Elizabethtown. Apparently it might have been in the good old days, you know.
Yeah.
But there wouldn't have been too far to go, I don't think, until they would have found a place there, because the tracks weren't too far from Main Street in either town, you know.
Sure.
But of course there was a hotel at Landisville. That was originally the Sycamore Hotel.
Yep.
That was the name of it.
Yep. Well, now, you mentioned about the highway, the 3-lane highway coming through. When was that?
In 1937 is when they built the 3-lane from here up. This was the 2-lane, which was built around 1919, if I remember rightly. It went up here to Hopsy Pfeiffer's, and there was an iron bridge there. There's a picture in here of the bridge. You go across there and go up through Chickies, past the dam, and up to the turn, up where the Hamilton farm was. Allie Brosey lived there in later years there, and made a sharp turn to the left. It took these 3 dangerous curves out when they built this 3-lane, and that was 1937. In 1919, when they built the cement road here from Lancaster to Harrisburg, at least that's what I remember of. It was originally 2-lane cement highway, and as far as I know, as far as I could keep track of him, hand finished this cement road. His name was Harry Bell, and he had a helper. I don't know what his name was, but they had a belt about a foot wide, had handles on it, and they'd all mixed by a gasoline engine, you know. They'd dump the things in the, lift it up, and then they'd mix it and send it out on a track here, and over here. Then they'd level her out, you know. Then they'd run this belt over, back and forward, till they had it nice and smooth. And then Harry Bell is the guy that done the last finishing by hand. And as far as I know, he finished this whole road by hand. And I'll tell you, they didn't lay a mile of concrete in a day. It took a few days. But that's how this road was built,
That's
really.
amazing. Yeah. Now, before the cement road, it was a dirt road, was it, or is it?
It was probably cinders and stones, and I remember when there was about only 4 cars in town. Norm Bear had a 1912 Ford Roadster. Doc Hennig had a 14 Buick. I'm only a kid then, you know. This could have been a little later on. Ed Myers had a car. I think our newcomer had a Saxon 6. Jake Minnick lived next door when we first moved up here, had a 1909 or 1910 Ford, and so on, you know.
Sure.
But I remember when the old loafers used to sit in front of Sam Eby's store up here, and Norm Beard get down through here about 20 miles an hour, and stones were flying, and everybody says, hell, this can't keep going. It's going too fast. And that's something.
Yep. Well, now, during this time, were there toll gates along this road?
Yes, that's right. And the toll gates that I remember, there's 3 that I remember real well. I'll start out with up at Chickies. A man by the name of Petey Wademan, I think, was a toll gate keeper right the middle of Chickies. Then there was one over at Centerville. A man, all I can think of is Blaney. In them days they had hobos, transits, you know. And he was a toll gate keeper. And he told my daddy, I remember my daddy saying that, he told my daddy when his parents aren't once around anymore, he's going to be a hobo. And that's what he ended up being when they get rid of the toll gates. There was a toll gate in toward Lancaster, too. I remember sort of them. But the toll gate here at Salunga was down around where the pavilion is. And that John Momaw was a toll gate keeper. Bill Momaw's daddy. Bill's the one that was struck up here at the highway, you know. His daddy run the toll gate. And when they quit the toll gate business, he sold that to Walter Pfeiffer. And Harry Griner moved that house from down there around where the pavilion is up to the northwest intersection of Main and Oak. That's the street that goes down to Klein's and up to the Mennonite Church. That house was moved from there up. Yeah, and Walter Pfeiffer. And Walter Pfeiffer was married to Edith Cooper, one of the Coopers. And that'd be Howard Pfeiffer's brother.
And you said that Mr. Griner moved some other houses. Was he famous for that?
Harry Griner moved a house that was down around where the bank is, that double house. I think he moved from there up. The only person I remember living in there lately was Teresa McGuire. Teresa worked with Sheets down in the Justice. Teresa McGuire lived in that house, and that was moved up there. There was a house across the creek, across the bridge here. That's where Mellie Newcomer's daddy lived. And Mellie and Earl Newcomer were born and raised there, next to our Hearst butcher shop. And Rapsmeyers bought that from Mel Newcomer when Mel bought a house back here in Broad Street. right next to the house that Abe Culp had built. Harry Griner moved that house from here up to where it sits today, right on this side of the Brethren Church. And Rap Smyers lived that. Now one of his grandchildren live in there, I think. Right next to the well drilling business there. That house was moved. There was a barn up here that Harry moved. And Bill Cooper, I guess when he quit the blacksmith business, he bought a barn up here back of old Doc Kendick's house where Johnny Kendick lived, the Johnny Kendick's house. And that barn he moved out to where the trailer park is now. And Bill Cooper built that brick house where the trailer park is, where young Russ Cooper lives now. And there was a barn there, and Bill Cooper, it's about 10, 15, 20 acres, I'm not sure which. And he farmed there, done a little farming and so on. Then when Bill, I don't know if he sold it or if he passed away, I'm not sure. But Sam Hess bought that. And he farmed there. And talk about high prices. My kids used to go out to Sam Hess's or up to Howard Pfeiffer with two quart buckets, galvanized buckets, and get 4 quart of milk for 25 cents. And 10 cents for a big bowl of cottage cheese or what am I trying to say? That sticky stuff.
Molasses.
No, you make it out of milk. Cup cheese.
Oh.
Why can't? I'm thinking of too many things, and trying to say them all at the same time. But that's the price of things, in those days.
Well, I notice you have a list here of prices back in 1916, 1917.
Okay, we'll get some of these.
Take a look at some of those prices.
You have your glasses on.
Oh, that's okay.
You just read a couple of them.
Well.
Then you're going to take a picture of that and
Yep.
frame it or something.
Dozen eggs, 15 cents. What else we got here? Butter, 18 cents.
Pound.
Yeah.
18 cents.
Yep. Bologna, 12 cents a pound. Oh, my. Well, celery, 10 cents a bunch. Apples, a half a peck, 15 cents. That's not bad.
And that's something.
Not bad, yeah. I was going to talk to you about looking back and some people that you've known in the past and that we ought to know about from Salunga. And the first one that you mentioned was somebody named Q.O. Reitzel.
Quint Reitzel was, when I first learned to know him, he used to take us kids out along the creek. And he belonged to the National Guards. And he'd take his pistol along. And this is, he couldn't do it with that one. But I'll tell you something. He could shoot the heads off of snakes across the creek. The creek wasn't very wide. But that's how good a pistol shot he was. But that was his endeavor, that's what he liked to do. But he was in the House of Representatives at Harrisburg. He was a dyed-in-the-wool politician too. He was in the House of Representatives at Harrisburg up there for a number of years. And then when I don't know if he lost out there, if he just decided to, he was retired. I think he retired as a brigadier general out of the Army, So he had a pretty good income. And when he retired then, more or less, I guess, out of his Harrisburg job, he was a recorder of deeds at the courthouse at Lancaster. And during all of those years that he was in was when Billy Christ was a representative. He was there for all his life, I think, for 40 years maybe, I don't know. A Republican. There were more Republicans than Democrats in those days. But that was, Billy Grice was one of the henchmen then. But Q.O. was, and he was also the first president of the Salunga Fire Company. From from 1910 to 1918. 1910 is when the fire was down here at the mill at Musselman's. It was Musselman's then. Annie Musselman's. That was Melly Newcomer's wife. Well, Annie Musselman, the Musselmans raised Melly Newcomer's wife, Elizabeth Hacker. And that was Musselman's mill at that time.
Now Heaston's Mill, or it was Heaston's Mill?
It was Heaston's. And then at one time, I'm not too sure if that was Stauffer's or not, but before Heaston got the store, that was Stauffer's store before. Now, I don't know if the mill was between Musselman's and Stauffer's or the other way around. I'm not sure if Stauffer had the mill or not. But that was the old mill where Easton later on had it. And that fire was in 1910. And that's when the Salunga decided to get a fire engine. And they got a pusher pumper. They wanted you to pull around by hand, you know. And that was 1910. Q.O. Reitzel, 1910 to 1918. Sam Eby, that had the store, was from 1919 to 1924. And Sam Eby also was a superintendent of the Methodist Episcopal Sunday School. I can still see him winding the clock every Sunday morning. And the lady who was the secretary was Miss Alice Strickler. She's sitting the other side of the table, you know. I can see him sitting there yet.
Now this is the Methodist Church right
The
now?
Methodist Church, and I was knee-high to a grasshopper. And that time, that's right.
Well, now tell me about the original Myers drilling. Was that...
Well, from what I was told and what I can remember people talking about, really, was when Ed Myers came over here from York County or close to the Maryland line, maybe in Maryland, I'm not too sure. He apparently got the idea to drill wells, and between he and a character, I guess you'd say, Bully Strickler, John Bully Strickler, they put together a steam rig, a steam engine, and the steam is what run the steam engine and pulled your rope up and down to drill the wells. And that there's of course there's a picture in here shows Bully Strickler. Don't show a picture of Ed Myers though. But that's apparently where this well drilling business all started. And then there was a couple of Adam Wolf and Dick Wolf. They worked for Myers's for a number of years, and they got the idea that they wanted to start in the drilling business. But that didn't last very long. And then Harry Hunberger, he's with us, still lives. He lives, Leona, lives in Bill Momo's apartment, where Bill Momo's house. He started well drilling. He got into well drilling business and did real well. And of course today, Herb still has a couple drillers and he's still doing drilling. I don't think to quite the margin that Myers are doing, but I think Herb does mostly drilling in stone quarries for blast holes and stuff. I don't know. He probably might drill a couple of wells, but I think most of his is in stone quarries for blasting holes. Mm-hmm.
You had mentioned Abe Culp, too, as far as...
Well, Abe Culp was a character, no doubt about it. When things didn't go right, all his equipment was made, his steam engine and his threshing rigs and balers and all that was made in Waynesboro. And when things didn't go right, he used to say, I think I'll sell out and go to Waynesboro. One of those kind of guys, you know. But Abe used to have a bunch of about a half a dozen guys that went along with these. I don't know if they were always the same guys, but at least a half a dozen that went along with his thrashing rig. And well, you know how slow those old steam engines go, about 7 miles an hour, if they go that fast. And then, of course, he pulled his thrashing rig and his baler along the side. See, at them days, they used to bring all of their sheaves of wheat in, you know, into the barn. Well, Polecat Johnny was a trapper and a hunter and a fisherman. He didn't do much beside that. And if he had $10 in his pocket, he had a safety pin on it to make sure he didn't lose it.
Where did he live?
He lived out here at Shank Road and Spooky Nook Road. There was a little house in there on the southwest intersection of Shank Road and across from Armstrong there, right there. That's where he lived. And he used to have he had a net that was 8-10-foot square, and he'd put it in a creek. Had a big pole, you know, and he'd put it in a creek, and he had it all full of bread and this, that, and something else, whatever was good, would draw the fish in, you know. And when he'd lift that net up after a couple, 3 hours, he had about a bushel of fish in that net. But he hunted, and he trapped, and he fished, and he sold the fish, he sold the rabbits. I would venture to say that he would shoot several dozen rabbits in a day and clean them and sell them. And then, of course, he would trap and sell the hides and like that, you know. And I remember him talking about this. I never saw him with all of those rabbits that he sold, but at that particular time, that would have been before 1913. There was no licenses until 1913, and I'm not too sure how many years there were that there was no limit on what you could catch or keep, you know, like so. But Polecat Johnny was a character. No doubt about it.
You want to talk about Joe Miller?
Well, Joe Miller was by the way, talking about fishing, Joe Miller was quite a fisherman when he was a kid. He used to go up here to the creek, and he'd catch suckers like you wouldn't believe, and he'd fish all day long when he was a kid. I don't know how old he was when he started out as a weightlifter, but when he first started out, of course, he started out with just a light weights, you know, and gradually grew into where he could lift several hundred pounds, you know, and put them above his head. He was quite a specimen. I think he and the good boys from over at Ephrata in the Olympic Games, I think they came in like 7th, the strongest men in the world. So they were, Hen was quite well, they called him Joe, we called him Hen. His name was Henry Miller, named after his great-grandpa, I guess. But he was quite he had a body like you say, he wouldn't quit, you know. He was really muscular.
When was he in the Olympics? What year?
1932 and 1936. 1932 and at Los Angeles and over in Germany. In Germany. He was in the Olympics in Germany and Los Angeles.
Did he live here most of his life then? Or
yeah, lived here all his life. His daddy, by the way, was a electrician on the railroad when they took care of the wire service and the tar and stuff here. Old Rube Miller, Hen's daddy, Rube Miller. He was one of the henchmen that worked with the train agents and so on down on the railroad. From what I remember, the trolley car came up through Centerville, down through Oyster Point, up Stony Battery Road to Church Street. In Church Street, there was a station there at Kaufman's, one of the Kaufman farms, and it came on up to camp meeting grounds. That was just a bunch of ties. There was ties with cinders and so on there, you know. And then it went up around the corner up to Bank Street, up to the Glass House. I guess everybody mentioned that.
Yep.
At the Glass House. And then it went up over a culvert there at the Reading Railroad. Went up over another culvert up over a trestle works. And then the next station up there was up at Cooper's. That was there about where Fred Kozer's funeral home was. A little building was in there. Then the next place was up here at Rotary. And that's a building that should be really historically preserved. Because that's one of the original powerhouses along the old trolley line. And the next was down here at Abe Culp's. There was a station here at Culp's. And there was one up here at the road, up at Prospect Road, there where the trailer park is. Then that went on up to where it left the railroad and went out past Bender's Mill and up through the farms. And why they ever went up through there, I'll never tell you. Why they didn't follow after the railroad tracks. But there was more people living out in the farms than there was along the pike here, along the Harrisburg Pike. See, there was no buildings up along there except the toll gate way up there at the Pike School.
Did that go to Mount Joy?
Yeah, up to Mount Joy, Elizabethtown. Going up to Elizabethtown. And when we were kids, we used to go up there on an open car for the picnics, you know, and we'd get up to Elizabethtown, and then you'd change over and get on a Hershey car and go over to Hershey.
How long did that take to go?
Probably a couple hours. It didn't go too lively. It probably took a couple hours, no doubt.
Sure. How long was the trolley here? When did the trolley stop running?
I would say in the middle 30s, probably. I'm not too sure, but probably 50 years or more. You know, like I say, time flies, and it doesn't seem as long as it was. Let's put it that way.
They replaced the trolley line then with buses?
Buses.
Did they follow the same route as the trolley? Or
No. Well, sort of, but not altogether. I guess they still come out through Lordstown and up here, don't they?
Yep.
Well, and they'd probably go about the same, only from here on up. Then, of course, they went up the highway instead of going over through the farms, you know.
Well, let's talk about school a little bit. You were talking
Well,
about...
you were talking about the normal school. Okay. When it seems to me, and I heard William R. Weaver, teacher and baseball scout, 94 years old. That's Paul Weaver's brother. First, I want to say about Paul Weaver, he wouldn't talk about himself. But when we were kids, he was a little older than we were. And we all played baseball, basketball, and football, and the whole bit. Paul Weaver wasn't allowed to play with any sports. He wasn't allowed to work at any hard jobs. He had a bad heart. He's 90 years old. He's still living. He wasn't allowed to take part in all these sports. Now, what I wanted to say, Bill Weaver, and I'll put and other ones too, but my two sisters, they went to high school at Landisville. They went 2 years and graduated. That's all it was, 2 years. They went to Millersville Normal School. That's why we were talking a while ago. 2 years, and they were teachers. Now, Bill Weaver taught us in 6th grade. Then, according to this, he graduated from F&M in 1922. Then he went to F&M to be a high school teacher. That's when he taught us in high school. My two sisters taught in the country schools. My one taught down around Intercourse. Another one taught up at Falmouth, and until they were married, you know, made all of $300 a year. About that, you know, that's about what they got. But anyhow, I want to say this. Here's Miss Ethel Steinkamp. Does that ring a bell? You remember that name?
No.
You don't remember? Okay. Miss Ethel Steinkamp was raised by P.W. Baker. Is that
Yes.
Ferris Baker? Ferris Baker's daughter, Mary Baker, who was married to Miller Eshelman, was our first grade and second grade teacher. Ferris Baker raised Miss Ethel Steinkamp. And among other teachers, Bill Weaver and Miss Steinkamp in our area when we were kids, I think they molded more characters in those days than all the other teachers put together. Now, in later years, I didn't go to school when Amos Herr or Mary Lee Forney talked, but those two probably are in the same category. But Bill Weaver took us spring training. He took us down along the creek down at Sandy Beach, down between here and Ephrata, and we got trained for baseball, football, basketball, and track, and we even did swimming meets and so on and so forth. Of course, we didn't have a swimming pool. We didn't have much of a basketball court either. It was on a cement floor. But I'll tell you, those people, they steered you right, no doubt about it. They were real. I don't think I studied much in school except when I was in the 7th and 8th grade with Miss Steinkamp. And then, of course, when we were in high school, when we had to study to play baseball, football, or basketball, if we didn't, we were kicked off the team. But between Bill Weaver and Miss Steinkamp, why, they did an awful lot for kids in our age group, you know.
Where was your school?
Up on top of the hill, the old school they tore down. Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Metzger was the principal of that school, and he came over from Columbia every day on the Reading Railroad. And I remember this very well. One winter, oh, I don't know what grade we were in. It might have been in the 4th, 5th, in the lower grades. We weren't in 7th or 8th with Miss Steinkamp, I know that. Heavy snowstorm, and around where it used to be Momoa's warehouse, there at what's that, Elizabeth Street and the railroad, where those banks are, you know. The railroad train came over there, and the snow drifts lifted the train right off the track. We missed a half a day school watching them taking the train out. But whoever the teacher was, they didn't give us too hard a time. But that's where Metzger came over every day, and he memorized all the textbooks, I think. He didn't have to look at a book to tell you what 3 and 4 was or whatever, you know. He knew.
That's great.
And he lived in Columbia. He was from Columbia.
Who were some of your schoolmates at that time?
Well, schoolmates, I could, if I had a picture someplace, but I tried to find it and I couldn't. But Simon Minnick, Amos Herr, George Shank, Hiram Blundy Diffendorfer, Howard Kreider, Sam Schertzer, Fred Kozer, Paris Rohr, and Florence Eby, Mildred Gensler, Mary Hershey, Leah Snavely. Her husband just died the other week at Hershey. It had Leah Snavely. And I remember when Ed Stauffer and Jay Dumbach graduated, 2-year class, there was either 5 or 7 girls, or else there was 7 or 9 in the graduating class.
You went from a football player to a football coach. How did you do that?
I don't know. It's the only reason I didn't play in that football team because I was married and had 4 children. No, I only had 3 up until that time. In 32, Fern was born. That's my daughter. She now lives out in Frisco, by the way. And she called and said everything's okay. She lives at the other end of town. She was walking across the street with 2 bags of groceries and her feet started to quiver. she didn't know what was going on. But she's all right. She's in the other, across the hill from where the damage was done. Okay. Well, I guess that's the only reason they needed a coach, and I was the only one who was available. Now the guys that played in that team was Amos Herr and Bob White were guards. Amos played guard. He could have been a fullback, but he wanted to play in the line. And Dutch Germer from Montjoy played end. Solly Gutschall played the other tackle, and Hen Snyder, he only weighed like 260. He played one guard. And the other end was, oh gee, I forget who played the other end. But anyhow, Pete Miller, Hen Miller, Joe Miller's brother, played halfback. Bus Kramer from Montjoy played fullback. And Cliff Dare, who played varsity football with Lafayette, he played a halfback. And I forget who played quarterback. Doesn't matter. But Dutch Keller played, Wilbur Heaston played. Then we had, besides the Montjoy guys, we had some guys from Lancaster that played. A Blackburn and a Graw, and I forget who else. We had a half a dozen guys from Lancaster that. No, we tied for the county championship with Columbia.
Now, when would that have been?
That'd be 1932. 1932, and that's when the races started at Landisville.
Okay, now tell me a bit about this now. Well, first of all, the football was down. Where was the football field that you
inside the race where the jalopy races run.
Which came first?
Well, I think they both started about the same time.
Oh.
The races really started over the Manham Pike, over at the old airport. And then old Scotty got the idea to run them around down here on his field, and took up a collection then. What we did was take up a collection to the football field too. And I remember one time that they were running around the track and they knocked our goalpost down. A bit of touch it on that end of the field, you had to get down the other end to kick the extra point.
Now, they didn't do those both the same day, or these were different days if they'd have the football?
On a Sunday, yeah.
Both the same day?
Yeah, on a Sunday.
Oh. Now when did that start with the football and the jalopy racing?
1932.
That was also 32.
1932. That's all in that, what I gave you people. That's a little story in there about the whole thing.
Sure. Now, what was a typical racing car look like? What did it look like in those days?
It didn't look like much. When they first started the jalopy races, you had to be able to, when the race was over, we could win $25. You had to be able to sell your race car for $25 when the race was over. So you weren't allowed, you didn't dare spend too much money on it to soup it up, But that's the way they started out. They had to be, and most of them were just pleasure cars with the body stripped off and just a couple of seats on. And there was one chap from when George Herman drove there, Russell Cooper drove there, Alvin Heisey drove there. They're guys from lived around here. Howard Dissinger drove here. Earl Myers from Bamford drove there. And two guys came in, importers. Dora Heaster from Reading and Otis Stein from York. And Otis later on got to be quite a sprint car driver. He was one of the best in the country at one time. But those guys, what's his name from over at Clay? I'll think of it after a while. Some of these guys drove over to the airport before they came over here. Then later on, they started to build the cars up a little bit. They charged a quarter to get in, I guess, whatever, 25 cents to get in the grandstand. Then they started to pay a little more money. Then they could spend a little more money on their cars and gradually got into sprint cars, more or less race cars. They looked like race cars. And I'm trying to think of this guy from over at Clay. he had a riding mechanic. He had a mechanic riding with him, you know. And the reason he had a riding mechanic in those days, those Jalopies days, that was over at the airport when they first started. This guy had a container of water and he had a pump, and he was pumped water in the radiator. His radiator leaked, so he had to have a riding mechanic. Can't see why I don't remember his name, but I don't remember. But that's where she all started.
Did they have any safety features in those days, like roll bars?
Very, very, very little. The only helmets that anybody had in them days was like an aviator's leather helmet, you know. And of course there was no seat belts, no nothing. And that went on even until they had the faster race cars. There wasn't too much safety devices. When I show my pictures of my old race cars and stuff, which I only have 8 suitcases full, I have a real elaborate filing system. But anyhow, when I show them to some of the guys that drove in the last 10 years, like Lynn Paxton from up here around Camp Hill and Williams Grove, he says, hell, he said, I wouldn't even sit in one of them, much less drive them. But they didn't have no. Then later on, of course, then they had seat belts, and they also had real helmets, you know, plastic helmets, or. But they didn't have roll bars. When they'd flip over, I saw this happen several times. Whenever they'd flip over, their head would hit the solid track, you know, and that was disastrous, you know. That was the end.
Was the speedway a flat track? I understand at one end it...
Well, yeah, it had a little dip there. And there was a guy from over at Allentown, Dutch Culp. Whenever he'd go over there, he'd raise up in his seat. It was a little dip there, yeah. And then up the back stretch, it was up a little grade.
Where was the grandstand?
The grandstand was, well, you wouldn't remember Jimmy Harris, but Jimmy Harris lived in a farm over toward the Camp Woods, to the west side of the speedway. And then over where Leroy Nisley's house stands now is where Adam Greer and his cousin had a motordrome where they run around motorcycles. Well, you know, up the side. I got some pictures of that too. There isn't much I don't have pictures of, to tell you the truth. But since we're talking about the racetrack now, I donated that script to the Lancaster County Historical Society, and I also, Jim, my son, well, you know Jim, he Xeroxed all of the old papers that had to do with the Landisville, Bird in Hand, and Lancaster Speedway in Maple Grove. He Xeroxed all of those copies, and they're in the Lancaster County Historical Society too. But in 1932, when I started in the race, I started taking tickets and selling tickets in the grandstand. Then I got to cover the races for the racing newspapers. And all of the racing results of all of the races, pre-race results and everything else, in those old racing newspapers since 1932, and the old National Auto Racing News, now it's called National Speed Sport, and the Illustrated Speedway News, they are all microfilmed, not just my works, my bylines, but everybody's around the whole country. And they're in the Library of Congress, and they'll be preserved forever.
How long was the track there?
Until about 39 or 40, around 1939. I tell you what happened.
Is this where they now have built homes?
What happened? Yeah, where those homes were built.
Main Street and Nisley Road.
Yeah, on the south.
Scotland Estates, I guess.
Yes.
On the south-west intersection. I tell you what happened. As long as we run races on a Sunday, got tremendous crowds and had no problem at all paying the drivers and the owners the sensible prizes, you know. Then along came some people who, I think the reason was because some people were a little envious that Scotty and his wife were making a couple bucks. I think that maybe that had more to do with it than the nuisance. But they said it was a nuisance, noise and dust and so on. Scotty used to pay to have Ad Gamber's house cleaned every week from the dust. That's right. But I think, like I said before, I think they were a little envious. Then they went to court and had the blue laws put on Scotty that he couldn't run on Sundays. He tried it on Saturdays, but it didn't work like Sunday. It didn't get the crowds. Then he spent a sizable sum to put some lights up, running at night, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, whatever. But never got the crowds back. The lights were not exactly a bargain. They had sort of dark spots in between, you know. The drivers complained. But then the drivers still wanted to be paid like they were paid on Sunday. But even with all the money that Scotty took in at the gate, didn't satisfy him. And the only thing that Scott and his wife had for their trouble was the concessions. That's about the only money that they made. So gradually, that's when it petered out, either 39 or 40, and that's when it put the end to it. Of course, then I continued working anything short of Indianapolis, Altoona, Langhorne, Trenton, the whole bit, Reading, Pottsville, you name it, I was there.
Go back for a little bit and talk about your musical career. You're quite a musician.
No, like I told you, I was probably the poorest one except my brother in Reading. But, well, that's all we ever knew, barbering and music, really, years ago. My daddy was a barber, and he was a great musician, and of course he had everybody in the community playing music. Well, you know from looking at these pictures here, the first band was organized in 1896, and I ain't too sure they weren't playing before that. They just didn't have uniforms, that's all. But guys here that people would know locally here that played was Truman Dissinger, Howard Dissinger, and Johnny Dissinger and their daddy, John Wademan from up in the Chickies area. He was from the Chickies area. Amos Snyder. We called him Spoon Snyder. And Irv Kepperly. Art Diffendorfer. There's a young Art Diffendorfer still lives in Landisville. I see him putting every Saturday night up at the Legion stands. Young Art. Albert Keller. Al Keller was a house painter and a used furniture dealer at the lower end of town here. He had sold used furniture for a number of years. And Gene Diffendorfer, that would have been a brother to Art and a uncle to these people. And Blundy Diffendorfer, who was on that school picture, that was his daddy. Hat Eshelman, and my daddy, and Frank Montooth, Elias Hunberger, that would be Herb Hunberger and Jim Hunberger, their grandpa. Phil Metzger, Oscar Way, my brother, and Bert Heaston, Connie and Bernie's uncle, Henry Heaston's brother, and Simon Heaston's brother, and my Uncle John.
That would be the town band? That wasn't...
This was a Salunga band, and it's taken on the Heaston's porch. Yeah.
How about the band they called the All Way Orchestra? What is that?
Well, that picture was taken at Mount Joy. It says 1898. I'm not too sure if that's... I know my brother Harry and I aren't on it. So it had to be pretty early. And it would be the All Way Band, 1898. My Uncle Will Way, he lived in Mount Joy. Frank lived in Mount Joy. My grandpa, Henry lived in West, that's where the family came from, West Donegal Street. Uncle George Way, one of his daughters lives down here in Church Street now. Mrs. Bachman, Eva Bachman. Uncle George had 3 daughters. He was married to Lizzie Wademan, a Wademan lady. Sadie, Eva, and Lena. When I was in grade school, Uncle George fell out of a tobacco ladder or a tobacco shed, broke his neck and killed him. And Aunt Lizzie raised those 3 daughters. And Sadie lives up in Williamsport. Lena lives over here, the other between Manham and Littleton Trailer Park, and Eva lives down in Church Street. They were my cousins, of course. And Uncle John, he lived in Mountjoy. His daughter's still living. Mildred, she worked for years for Psycho Company. And my brother Oscar ended up having a barber shop in Pine Street. Yeah. And Edgar and Alan, see, they're just knee-high to grasshoppers. But Edgar and Alan used to say they stood him on a soapbox and they played triple tongue solos when they were 10 years old. So I'm not about here yet. And of course my daddy, that's something in it, really.
Yep, yep.
Something.
And then other people got into this band, and he was the leader for a number of years?
We had that band until, I guess, during wartime. Mm-hmm. And that sort of broke up the whole works when the war came along. Then, in the early 20s, I'm not too sure what year, but it would have been after the war, then my daddy got a bunch of people together and called it a POSA band. That was a lodge. This Patriotic Order Sons of America. He was a great lodge man. I did tell you, he wrote a march called the POSA March, and to this day we can't find it. He composed the whole for a concert band, and up to now we can't find it. So I don't know. It's in among the music stuff, and I got it clobbered every place. But anyhow, that band played until, well, after my father passed away. We kind of tried to keep it together. John Kittner and Charlie Baker and myself, George Shank and Howard Klein and Barney Klein and the Habekers, Charlie Habeker for sure. And I'm not too, well, we used to get my uncles and cousins and stuff, the Habekers and Heisey, Elmer Heisey from Mountjoy, and we'd get, Uncle John would come down, and different ones that were still around, you know, they'd come down and help to play. And then, of course, outside of that orchestra is when my daddy first formed an orchestra, you know, that called, we'll put my glasses.
That's different than a band.
Yeah, this orchestra, it was called the Midnight Revelers. And did we ever revel? Well, as long as my father lived, now there's Charlie Baker, Johnny Piper, John Herr, Butcher, George Shank, Cletus Raffensperger, would have been a son to Rube Raffensperger here, Russell Geis, Fred Holbein, Frank Eshelman, farmer out here, played piano, Fred Kozer and myself, and a few other ones that I could mention that we had later on. But that was called the Midnight Revelers.
Now, let me interrupt. What's the difference between a band and an orchestra?
Well, the orchestra, when we had the orchestra, of course, we had a banjo, a guitar, and fiddles. Mm-hmm. And, of course, with the concert band, they were all reeds and brass, actually, and a rhythm, you know. Mm-hmm. But there was no strings or what am I trying to say? No strings, really.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in 1926, and of course, we played overtures. We played polkas, we played schottisch, We played all kind of ballads and so on, you know. My daddy wasn't too much of a dance man. But when he passed away, then that's when it went under my name. And then we started playing Dixieland. Then we imported musicians. Charlie Rich from Marietta, Bud Kane from Middletown, Louis Heisey from Elizabethtown, my cousin Dick Heisey. Of course, he might have played in the band, but he couldn't read music. But he played trombone like you wouldn't believe. And of course, later on, we had Hottie Kaufman, bass player. He could have played with Guy Lombardo. Finest tune on the bass horn you ever heard. And he was a bricklayer, you know. John Herr was a butcher. George Shank was a justice of the peace.
Where all did you play?
We played at service clubs, played up in the Moose at Eton. We played at Andy Brown's in Mount Joy. We played at Fun Bars in Mount Joy. Fun Bar had a beautiful ballroom. Speakeasy, but it was a ballroom. Over Nicky Dietz's, that was a speakeasy. And over at, well, at the Moose in Lancaster and places like that, you know. We didn't go too far distance. We didn't have too much transportation back in the 20s, you know.
How long did your band go on then, as far as?
Well, I get mixed up with this racing business in '32. And up until that time, I was interested in, I played a lot of golf then, too, and all that jazz, you know. Then around about 1934, I won a tournament at Longs Park playing golf. And that is about the last year that I think we played a couple jobs at 35 yet. But from 35, I dropped the band business and everything else, except girls, of course. You quit laughing. He's younger than I am. I still didn't drop girls. I still take them dancing. Enjoy every minute of it.
I've seen you up at the Legion.
Yeah. Now, that's when I quit all that. I was too busy. I had to keep my business going here, you know, but I was busy. I did a lot of my work at home, and I had the best Xerox machine you ever saw in your life. I had an old A.B. Dick with a barrel on, you know, and cut out a stencil and a typewriter. I sent sometimes 200 and some copies to newspapers. Yeah.
Well, that would keep you busy full time then.
Well, see, all I had to do was make a copy of it and then send them out, you know.
Sure.
But then after the race was over, well, a picture that you saw in there of me sitting at a typewriter at the running board of a 1928 Willys Overland. See, I was knocking out the results of the races. Then on the way home, I'd drop them off to give them to Jack Martin in at the Intel Journal. And from there, they went out in Associated Press all over anybody was interested. But I talked about Bill Weaver and Ethel Steinkamp teaching us kids what life is all about. I learned I never typed, and I didn't study journalism or anything like that. But I learned more from Jack Martin and George Kirkner during those years than a lot of people that go to school for X number of years. They taught me an awful lot, the important things. And when I look at some of the ads in the papers today, especially eating places, they want to confuse you. They don't want you to know who they are or where they're at. You know, you can't find their place of business, and their heading is all burled up. The best way to advertise anything, there you go, good block letters. How, when, and where, Jack says. Don't try to confuse them. And that's what you have to do. You have to know what you have to sell, and where, and when. And that's an important thing.
Sure.
You bet. And I made a pretty good living at that. I'll tell you, during the Depression, I started in 1932, Depression years, and I had, well, till 32 was over. Fern was born in May of 32. I had 4 youngsters, and I know what it was all about.